Thank you, Presiding Officer. Water is important to us. Now, that's a self-evident truth, not least because each and every one of us here is about 80% water. So without water, there is no human being, there is no human race. It's probably the only chemical that many people will know the formula for, H2O. And even people who know nothing of chemistry, if you say H2O, you'll see the light go on, they know you mean water. So it's something that is absolutely central to us. Too much of it, you drown, you die. Too little of it, you wither, you die. The right amount of water, you prosper. But it's very important, however you look at it. Ken McIntosh referred to Fort Augustus and the first power station that was there, 1896, aluminium factory had what's described, at least in Wikipedia, so it must be true, as the first large-scale commercial hydroelectric generation. In his remarks, of course, Ken McIntosh made reference to Sir James Henderson Stewart and some of the remarks that he made in Parliament in the war years. Quite astonished that he didn't pick up on some of the very important linkages that there are between that man and other events. The 1961 by-election, which followed his death, was the first parliamentary election in which I had any role. But even more critically, perhaps for Ken McIntosh, the 1961 by-election that followed the death of Sir James Henderson Stewart was the first parliamentary outing for John Smith, subsequently leader of the UK Labour Party, and he got 8,882 votes, some 26% of the poll, and actually managed to move the Labour Party up to second place. So he did pretty decently. Didn't sustain it in the 1964 election and moved on to elsewhere and eventually got elected, of course, in 1970. Water is also a great reservoir, and I think that's the right word, of innovation. It's something that, of course, led to engineering innovation in connection with irrigation thousands of years ago. The Archimedes screw, which is something we're familiar with today, is almost certainly not the Archimedes screw. It probably predates him by some 500 years and is thought to come from the time of the Assyrian king Sennacherib in about 700 BC. It was initially, of course, a device for lifting water, turned by hand, but quite rapidly became one of the very first sources of generating power from hydro by allowing water to fall through an Archimedes screw. And, of course, it was particularly effective where there was waste material in the water, where it was contaminated water, because it being free-flowing, it didn't really get jammed up in unfavourable conditions. And, of course, that brings us to an essential point about water in relation to today's debate. 1 cubic metre of water weighs 998 kilograms, i.e. about a tonne. So therefore you can see what the power is if that water moves, either horizontally or vertically. The early sources of extracting power from that were the under the water wheel, where the water flow underneath, an example of extracting the water from flow, not from fall. Whereas an overshot water wheel, of course, was a combination of underflow but overflow, the weight and it falling, a way of extracting power from water. It's worth saying that there is actually a formula, which I have somewhere in my notes, I'm sure. Basically, if you have 1 cubic metre of water falling 1 foot every second, you're going to get something like 96 megawatts. And that gives you an insight into the power there is in water. I hope that's right. I simply can't find the note, then I think I have got that written on. Water also, of course, caused innovation in lots of other ways. The first combustion engines were dependent on water, and the first of those was in the 1st century AD, when the Greek engineer Hero produced a machine called the Oleif aeolifile, which was basically a drum where, when you heated the drum, water heated up in the drum, steam came out vents, and the drum spun on an axle. Incidentally, Hero was also the first inventor of a coin-operated dispenser 2,000 years ago, which dispensed, yes, you've guessed it, water. Now, transmission of electricity, which is one of the great benefits we have from water's use in Scotland, is, of course, quite a significant problem. We've talked about some of the issues around the network. We're far from having them solved. It takes a long time to create the right kind of infrastructure, and it was probably, in many ways, the most challenging part of the development of hydropower in Scotland. Not just generating the electricity, but getting it to the suppliers. My wife, who was brought up in a council house on the shores of Loch Ness, was at the opposite corner of Loch Ness, where 60 years earlier, of course, the first electricity was generated from hydropower. But she was in secondary school before the electricity reached her. And to this day, the brass paraffin lamp, which she studied beside when she was a youngster, sits in her living room as a reminder that in her lifetime, in my lifetime, and one or two others in the chamber, the world was very different. Electricity was not something that got delivered to all but a few homes. There are other ways, of course, of transmitting power from water. In some places, it's done by compressed air, which is actually, I think, Mary Scanlon, a more mechanically efficient way than actually generating electricity, because you can transfer the power from water energy to another location with no moving parts of any kind, and hence there are no mechanical losses associated with it. It's also worth saying, of course, that water is a strategic asset for countries. Look at NASA's building of the Aswan Dam, which was for irrigation, but also for hydropower. And, of course, the current debate there is, debate I think is the right word, between Sudan and Egypt, as Sudan seeks to dam the Nile.
Mr Stevenson, could you begin to conclude, please?
I will certainly think about that, Presiding Officer. It's also, of course, our hydro schemes, something that's attracted tourism. Just think of the salmon ladder associated with hydropower at Pitlochry. Let me just close, Presiding Officer, as invited so to do, by saying that what Tom Johnson created is something that lives with us today and isn't just a supplier of power. There's an emotional attachment to people in the north of Scotland. There might be the brand SSE on the side of the vans these days, but people generally still talk about it as the hydro. Presiding Officer.